Hello everyone and welcome to the Constructive Criticism Network. This network is here to help you improve at Magic the Gathering at every level. From Pauper Leagues to Top 1000 Mythic, we've got you covered. If you want to hear the entire network, head on over to our sponsor at puremtgo.com, where you can hear each and every show, each and every week, and check out their sponsor, MTGO Traders, and tell them that the CCMTG Network sent you. Now sit back, enjoy the show. From YouTube, podcasts, and more, here's this week's episode from ConstructiveCriticism.com. Hello everyone and welcome to a brand new episode of Mythicast. I'm your host just like every week, Spencer, and this week I'm joined by a special guest. A lover of all things Pokemon except for post-game content, James Harris.
What's going on, guys?
Do you like being called out like that just to start the show?
Yeah, I do love that. We were just talking and I don't do post-game content, so.
There you go. I mean, you called yourself a fraud, James, and I think that, you know, what you really are is just the real Palatown hero, you know? It's not like Ash has ever, like, beaten the Battle Tower. Come on.
Yeah, we run through the gyms, we run through the Elite Four, and then we sit in the Champions Room. That's how it goes. Exactly.
It's kind of like your run to Mythic, man. You just gotta sit there. Before we get too far into this, or we talk too much about James and his love for running the gyms, don't forget to check out our sponsor at puremtgo.com. They're really appreciated. And once again, our Patreon is on hold during coronavirus. You know, I don't want to open up a new monetization when there are just other content creators who could use that money a lot more than I could. So once all this is over, we'll open one up. If you have an idea for the Patreon, go to shoot an email over to heezymedia@gmail.com, and I'll take a look at it. And if I love your idea enough and use it, we're gonna give out 1 year of top level Patreon for free to the best idea. So thank you everybody so much. And let's talk about you though, James. James, you got Mythic last month.
Yeah, I got Mythic. It actually happened really quickly, just playing Gruul Midrange.
So talk to me about you, James. Like, how long have you been playing Magic? What are your why do you play Magic? Like, tell me about it.
So I first picked up a Magic card during Return to Ravnica, and I played through Gatecrash and then quickly realized this hobby's way too expensive. I can't afford it. So I dropped Magic, started playing fighting games, played competitive Street Fighter for years until Guild of Ravnica came out. And then, you know, had a little bit more money, had a little bit more free time, started playing the game, you know, the weekend that it released, and just haven't really looked back since. Just been playing a ton of Standard, a ton of Pioneer, and a ton of Arena.
Awesome, man. Is there anything that Street Fighter taught you about Magic?
Yeah, I think like playing fighting games, you have to be able to read your opponent and kind of keep them on the back foot once you have an advantage. And Magic's kind of the same way. So I feel like I can read my opponents pretty well. I can play around things pretty well, to just kind of, once I get that advantage, keep my opponent on the back foot and run away with the game.
It's funny because I think playing from ahead is actually one of the harder things to do in Magic. So it's interesting that you're kind of talking about being able to do that through fighting games. That's an interesting concept that I had not thought about Smash Bros helping me with. But I'm actually really bad at maintaining my advantage in neutral, so...
Oh, you talking about in Smash?
Yeah.
Well, are there like invincible wake up moves and things like that in Smash Brothers?
Yeah, there are people with invincibility frames on moves, yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, in fighting games you just kind of play around that, and if you put a read on your opponent that they're going to do it, you block and punish. And in Magic it's kind of the same way. When you're an advantage, if you think your opponent has a card that, you know, could really set you behind, you make them waste it on something that isn't really that valuable to you, and then you drop your bomb. So
awesome. Well, I think today's deck is a really good deck to talk about kind of this concept on. So what deck are we going to talk about today?
So we're talking about Gruul Midrange. You can talk about the deck list a little bit, but we're playing the 4 full set of Ember Cleaves and Questing Beasts, and you know, really just trying to cleave our opponent to death.
Yeah, before we get into the deck, why don't we kind of talk about your journey to Mythic? Like, what did you play against on your way to Mythic with this deck? And
So I
also,
played
what we're
against.
talking about historic too, by the way. We should probably call that out.
Oh yeah, this is historic. I played against a lot of the mono white life gain, a ton of Esper and Grixis control. I played the mirror a fair amount. There are people playing mono red on my way up, and then there's a ton of Bant decks either playing Field of the Dead or playing Wilderness Reclamation and Nexus of Fate. And that's pretty much the entire meta game of historic. It's a pretty wide open format.
Yeah, it sounds like you kind of really ran the gauntlet with this one. How long did it take you once you started?
Um, it took a few hours a day, maybe like 2 to 3 for 4 or 5 days. I didn't even realize how much I was ranking up, and then I just noticed that I had jumped from like plat 2 to diamond 2. And I just thought, okay, like I could actually make a run at this and go for it. So at that point, I started going for it, and it didn't take very long. That day, I ended up hitting it. So.
Awesome. Is there any changes that you made along the way?
When I started out, I was playing 2 Domri's Ambush and I was playing 2 Gruul Spellbreakers. But I was running into a ton of creature decks and really felt like I needed those extra removal spells. So I cut the Spellbreakers, put in the removal spells, and then there were 2 cards in the sideboard that weren't Cindervines and Fry, the third copies of each. And I don't remember what they were, but I cut them and I put in the Cindervines and the Fry. I tried Grafdigger's Cage for a little while to deal with Uro, and that card didn't really feel good. So I cut that back out and settled on the 15 in the side that we've got right now.
Yeah, I think Cindervine specifically in this metagame is pretty important. I think you're likely to run into quite a bit of Nexus decks, and you really need that card for this deck to succeed against that deck.
You really do. It's kind of the most important card in the matchup, unless you just get the nut draw and you can cleave your opponent to death really quickly.
Yeah.
But that doesn't happen that often, and it's kind of like you'd be a glass cannon if you were relying on it. So Cindervines is very important.
Well, let's go over to the deck really quickly, and I will pull up the deck list for those at home. All right, so we have 4 Llanowar Elves, 4 Pelt Collector, 4 Burning Emissary, 2 Gala the Endless Dance, 4 Zertog Goblin, 4 Bone Crusher Giant, 2 Rampaging Ferocodon, 4 Questing Beast, 4 Domri's Ambush, 4 Embercleave, 24 land, one of which being a Castle Embrith, replacing the 8th Mountain, and then 4 of each of the dual lands. And then the sideboard, as mentioned, was 3 Cindervines, 3 Fry, 3 Lava Coil, 2 Bloodson, 2 Rampaging Ferocodon, and 2 Rekindling Phoenix. So, this deck is pretty hot, man. It's a spicy one. Was this something that you came up with? Just like, I mean, I know that a lot of this stuff is non-traditional, right? Like the Rampaging Ferocodons in the main, stuff like that. Like, how did you come up with this 75?
So I had been thinking about playing Historic for a while as soon as they said Burning Tree Emissary was going to come out.
Sure.
So I was excited about that card. I thought it could do a lot for the deck. And so I had a version built, and then I hopped on. I played a little bit of mono white, and I was playing against this deck. And was just like, this deck is actually nuts. Let me go build it. And I had run into the mono white mirror enough to where I felt like Rampaging Ferocodon was actually an important inclusion in the main deck. So I pulled the original list up from MTG Goldfish quite a few months ago. And had it just kind of sitting, waiting to be crafted before I did this. So a lot of credit goes to MTG Goldfish for the base of it. But there are just a couple of cards that are a little different from what I saw in there. Rampaging Ferocodon being one of them, and the 3rd Fry and the 3rd Cindervines being one of them.
Sure. What's the main way that you're winning with this deck?
You're either vomiting out a hand that has Llanowar Elves, Pelt Collector, Burning Tree, Zerta Goblin, and then hitting a Cleave, or Questing Beast with a Cleave on it. Those cards in succession with each other just present, 9 power on turn 2. And then you're threatening to drop a hasty 4/4 or an Embercleave after that, and it really makes it hard for your opponent to come back.
Would you say that so what would you say are like the most important cards? Is Embercleave number 1? Is Questing Beast number 1?
I actually think that the top 3 cards are Llanowar Elves, Questing Beast, and Embercleave. At least whenever I hit Mythic. But Questing Beast and Embercleave are definitely cards that you want in your opening hand every time.
Talk about that interaction. I think a lot of people at home are pretty familiar, but I mean, just how valuable is that Death Touch double strike?
Well, unless your opponent blocks with 10 on the back, or 10 different creatures, they're going to take some trample damage because Questing Beast only has to assign 1 point of damage to anything blocking it, and then the rest is going to be trample damage with Embercleave and Double Strike, also from Embercleave. So they're probably going to take 8 to 10 damage because they'll only have a creature or 2 to block with, and that is just huge for 2 cards that interact together.
You said Llanowar Elves is one of the most important cards, but you actually only have 1 3-drop that you really want to cast with it. Can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, I think that Llanowar Elves is going to help you get your Questing Beast faster. It's going to help you cast Pelt Collector, Burning Tree Emissary, and Zerta Goblin all on turn 2. And just without that, you can't get all of that. And then you'll still be holding on to that extra mana come turn 3, and that's when you can drop your Questing Beast. And the mana in this deck is pretty bad, so having a little bit of help with Llanowar Elves
just to
really
get the double
important.
green.
Yeah, to get the double green, because sometimes you're sitting on too much red mana in your hand, and sometimes you don't have any red mana. You're kind of starved. And when that happens, it's kind of tough. But Llanowar Elves at least helps with some acceleration and some green fixing.
So let's talk about the mana. You talked about how the mana base is kind of bad. I mean, you're playing, almost 16 basics. Is there considerations for 2 green-red tap lands, or or even just since your mana base is so worse? I know that you have 1 Castle Embereth. Have you considered playing 2? Kind of talk to me about the mana and things that you've considered in it.
Well, I've been thinking about the tap lands, and I just don't think that you could afford to draw too many of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been thinking about Fabled Passage as well. And those lands coming in tapped for a deck that we're calling mid-range, but really wants to have an aggressive draw, can really just set you back, and you don't want to be set back at all.
Right.
So you're kind of just going on a wing and a prayer that your mana is going to cooperate with you. And having an 8-8 split of forests and mountains, and then the 4 stomping grounds, 4 rootbound crags, oftentimes is enough. But there are times where I've just thought, man, I wish that this, 4th land in my hand was a Fabled Passage, so I could go fetch my red source.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Is there a coolest interaction in this deck other than the Embercleave on the Questing Beast? Is there another one that you're just every time you're just like, yeah, that was sweet?
Domri's Ambush with Questing Beast is going to help a lot in terms of dealing with an Uro, dealing with a really big Krasis, dealing with the Green Cavalier, because you can't attack through that stuff, and you don't have a removal spell that's big enough to kill it. So you've got to get a little creative, and Questing Beast, Domri's Ambush is always a good answer.
Got to get that Death Touch interactions when you can.
Yeah.
What are the decks that you want to play against the most with this deck?
So I had a ton of success against Mono Red. Your removal is so good in Domri's Ambush, and you get Lava Coils post board and Bone Crusher Giants in the main. So you have a ton of removal to deal with their Steamkins, to deal with their Chain Whirlers, to deal with anything, and leave behind a big creature that they have a lot of trouble attacking through. And then playing against the mono white decks was actually really easy with the 4 Rampaging Ferocidons. They can't gain life, they can't grow their Ajani's Pridemates.
Yeah.
Every time they play something, rather than gain a life, they're taking a damage. So those decks were really, really easy. And then I love playing the Mirror. The Mirror is one of my favorite matches to play, and I think that I've adapted to it pretty well and have a pretty high win rate in the Mirror.
Is there a deck or two that you don't want to play against?
I don't want to play against a deck that's playing Uro, Field of the Dead, and 4-mana Wraths.
It's true.
Those decks are really tough to play against.
What is your plan in those matchups?
You kind of have no choice but to run out your Rampaging Ferocidon as early as you can. And you have to understand that it might get removed, but you can't allow them to gain that life. And you want to draw a second one because they're going to wrath you at some point. So if you have a hand with 2 and you have the mana to cast it, I would say keep it and just don't allow them to gain the life and let Questing Beast and Embercleave take care of the rest.
In the show notes, I'll have a sideboard guide that you posted to Twitter available for people to kind of look at. But one of the things that was really interesting to me when I saw this list was actually bloodson. Have you found bloodson to actually be super helpful in those field deck matchups?
I've only cast it once, and it was really helpful. The problem with those matchups that we really haven't talked about is Aether Gust. Aether Gust can get rid of anything that you're playing, and so if you run out of bloodson, they can Aether Gust it away, get a few zombies, and you can always replay it, but
a lot of the damage is done.
Yeah, a lot of the damage is done. Absolutely.
So have you? Is there like are you always trying to take the most aggressive line in those matchups? Are you like what's the strategy? I mean, the matchup certainly feels like if they're playing Bantfield and they've got wrath effects that it's kind of a dumpster fire for you.
Yeah, you want to present enough power on the board to where they have to deal with it, but you want to hold back a few cards in your hand. So if you can present 6 or 7 power and still keep a Questing Beast, you want to do that. You're threatening to Embercleave at that point. You might have the Embercleave, you can cast it, you can get that double strike damage in, and they're going to have to deal with your board. So just draw some cards. Gallia has been pretty good in those matchups. You could probably, once a Wrath gets cast, play a Gallia and another threat, and then follow it up with another hasty creature, get a couple of cards back, and try to regain the advantage. You just don't want to play too much into their Wraths. You don't want to let them take away everything from you, and you're sitting there with no cards in your hand, and they're gaining 3 life, drawing a card, hitting you for 6 damage every turn. You'll never come back from that.
You mentioned in your sideboard guide that you think it's correct to take the draw in the mirror. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, in the mirror, you want to take the draw because on turn 2, say they cast a Burning Tree Emissary and another threat, a Zerta Goblin or something like that. You can play your Burning Tree Emissary and remove their 3/3 Zerta Goblin, and now you're ahead on power on the board. And you always want the extra card because you're going to trade a ton of removal back and forth, and having that extra card has been really helpful. The times where it hasn't worked for me is whenever I'm playing a list that's playing like a Clothis, or maybe they have Gruul Spellbreaker in the main because they can go a little bit bigger than I could go. But even in the matches where they are playing Gruul Spellbreaker, I've been taking the draw and still winning a pretty fair amount.
Is there any changes that you would make to this deck if somebody were to pick it up and play it from this podcast?
Well, right now, we talked a little bit before the show about Llanowar Elves not being very good right now. So I'm considering taking some Llanowar Elves out and adding those Gruul Spellbreakers to go a little bit bigger, because you want to be able to present, like I said, enough damage in every matchup to where they have to answer it, especially in the control matchups or the Bant matchups. And Llanowar Elves, just, if you draw it late game, it's not very good at all. So Llanowar Elves is definitely on the chopping block for me right now.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think adding Gruul Spellbreaker in some capacity would help this deck a lot too. Anything cards from the new set that you were looking at?
I actually haven't looked at any spoilers from the new set. Resident Evil 3 has been overrunning my life right now, so I haven't kept up too much with Magic. I'm just getting my my daily goals in and then hopping back on PS4.
Fair enough. Is there any advice that you would give to anybody picking this deck up before we wrap up?
Yeah, don't plan to settle the wreckage. That's a card in this format. There were a couple times where I completely forgot about it and lost a game because of it. The most atrocious one, I attacked with 2 elves and a phoenix to cast an Embercleave, and I could have just tapped the elves for mana. I lost all 3 of my creatures, and I was just set back so far. And I was just looking at my board every turn at this Embercleave sitting there saying, you could at least be on an elf right now, and I could be hitting for 4 or 5 damage a turn. But
that's all right. You'll have Gruul Spellbreakers in the future, and they won't be able to do that.
Yeah, that'll be incredible.
Well, I just want to say thank you, James, so much for coming on today. It means a lot. Every time somebody comes on through the Twitter threads, it's the best for me. Like I love being able to reach out to people who tweet at the show and talk about their journey to Mythic. And it sounds like yours was a lot of fun. You just got to go on a winning streak and play a deck that you really really enjoyed.
Yeah. Like I said, I was excited about playing Gruul since I saw Burning Tree was going to get added to the format, and it really just happened without me realizing it. I was playing and having a good time and noticed how far up I had climbed, and then I decided to go for it.
If people wanted to find you and talk to you about the deck, where can they do that?
You could find me on Twitter at PowitTown_hero. And I'm also on Instagram, if you like car stuff, at Southside Dents.
Nice. I'll have to check that out. You can find the entire Constructed Criticism Network over at constructedcriticism.com and on purempgo.com. You can find the show at Arena Mythic Cast. If you want to join the show, don't forget to tweet at the show when you hit Mythic, and we'll see if we can get you on. That includes both Constructed and Limited now, and I'm really excited for the future of those 2 formats. James, once again, man, thank you so much for coming on. This was a ton of fun, and we got to talk about one of my favorite decks.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a blast. Maybe I'll get on next month with some other crazy deck.
Yeah, man. I always tell everybody if I have a good time, you're always invited back on, and you definitely fit that quality. So thank you guys so much, and we'll see everybody next week with another episode of Mythic Cast.